Dave, thanks so much for that kind introduction. I am so happy to be here with the Tugboat community. I have very warm feelings for that community, having worked with Dave from the very early days of Tugboat. So I am also very grateful for the opportunity to come talk to you about Gen Z. I, along with three others, did a study of Gen Z that encompassed over 100 in-depth interviews and 2,000 surveys of 2,000 people, and the analysis of 70 million words used by people in Gen Z. And we, the team of us, when we started working, I think had some questions about what we were seeing. We were all working in universities, and we had questions about some of the changes we were seeing in these people. And that was what inspired us to do this study. I also want to start by saying, just giving a little explanation of why to do generational research. Obviously, not every person in a generation is going to be an exemplar of the things that we define as generational. It's a 30,000 foot look. But we do generational research because we know that the things that people experience, particularly when they are young, they can experience some things in common. So we think about the so-called silent generation. They experienced the Depression. They experienced World War II. Those had a big impact on how they saw the world, on their values. We think of them as strong and stoic because of the experience. Same thing with baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer. And we think of baby boomers as having experienced post-war prosperity, also the Cold War and rock and roll and the pill, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. And my generation often gets viewed as idealistic and complacent. The Gen Xers were in essence 1965 to 1980, more or less. That was the very beginning of the computer age. That was when we first saw widespread use of voicemail. Cell phones began to be used, early feminism, more frequent air travel. People had a growing sense of the world. Also divorce, latchkey kids, MTV, and grunge. And so Gen X, we sort of characterized as worldly, more worldly, but also a little cynical. Then came along Gen Y, 1981 to the mid-90s. And you'll notice that these generations are 15 to 20 years, more or less. And Gen Y, we think of as the quote unquote digital natives, because that's when technology really started to advance in our lives. But we also think of Gen Y, who are also known as the millennials, as having had coddled childhoods, helicopter parenting. That's when fame, money became more prevalent, People magazine. And we think they are often called entitled, arrogant, and narcissistic. So now we get to Gen Z, and we think of Gen Z as starting in the mid-90s. There's some question as to whether it was before 1995, after 1995, but it was in that period. We, for our purposes in this study, studied people that had been born around 1995, a little before, a little after, and we focused on that age group. I was the general counsel at Netscape, so I know very well how significant the introduction of the internet and this blossoming of websites and opportunities. Amazon started in 1995. So we know that had a significant impact starting in the mid-90s. And so we want to look at these people that were born around that time and after that time to see what this impact was. So I'm going to show you a slide of how people have characterized Gen Z. And you can see from these bullet points, they are not particularly kind terms about Gen Z. Snowflakes who need safe spaces, they're coddled, completely unprepared for adulthood, mentally unhealthy, less happy, unwilling to work hard, lacking respect for their elders, irresponsible, addicted to technology, naive, and narcissistic. Now, I don't know how you feel about Gen Z, and I'm assuming that you are now starting to experience Gen Z employees, and many of you will have Gen Z children. But this is how many people have thought about Gen Z. And it's very interesting to think about, with that in mind, what Gen Z was experiencing while they were growing up. And I now want you to think about being, say, 10 years old and experiencing these things. Early exposure and access to a big, diverse, often frightening world. The scope of what they encountered was unlike anything that we elders had encountered while we were growing up. It's been characterized as a whitewater world. Constant change happening very, very quickly. And we know that from our own lives. As older adults, we were going through some of the same turbulence, but we were doing it as adults with a different kind of foundation. For these kids growing up, it was all about speed, fast, fast, fast. And then millions of bits and bytes of information, constant, lots of information. Think about the scale of what they were trying to take in. And we, as adults, were doing the same thing, but they were doing it as children. Hyperconnectivity. They could talk many to many. You know, the telephone allowed us to talk initially one-to-one, then one-to-many. Think about what the networks have done in terms of massive communication, huge change in communication. That's what these kids have known from their earliest experiences. In many cases, parent-child role reversal, because we adults were going through this at the same time that we were trying to make a living and run households and so on. And it was overwhelming. So there are all the jokes about the parents who can't program the TV and who can't figure out what to do on the computer. These kids were the ones who were telling their parents how to do it. And it was a joke, but it was also very serious, because for the kids, that was very disruptive of the normal sort of sense where parents teach the children. These kids also went through the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. They watched their parents go through very troubling times, and for many of them. They experienced the gig economy. So again, that notion that work could be short-term, it wasn't something you could rely on. Your employer was not something you could rely on. And so it's again, a very piecemeal kind of experience. For them, climate change was very real. People were talking about it, and it was very real and very frightening. And then I want to mention school shootings, because for this generation, particularly in the US, school shootings have been a major experience from their early youth on. So these are the things that they as children were taking in. This was the world as they knew it. And what that meant, and I especially want you to think about the scope, speed, and scale points, because all of us were going through it, but these were young children. Now, I showed you the slide of the negative things said about this generation. Our interviews of these Gen Z kids were so rich with wonderful things that they said. And I pulled this one quote out because I think it is, it's a very lovely sentiment. And I'm going to read it. It's long, but I'm going to read it. I think that the only thing that I'd like to share is juvenoia kind of sucks. That's a word he made up, I think, juvenoia. It's the feeling. It's kind of like paranoia. It's where one generation looks down on the next generation. So if you're like 40, you're like, oh, those 20-year-olds are doing all these drugs and they're all on their computers. And But the thing is, like, every generation does that. So I think that assuming that the next generation is going to be worse than the previous generation is kind of a dumb thing, just because we've had a lot of generations and they've all turned out to be pretty fine, considering that we're here. Humanity has survived. So I just, this quote is very telling, because it explains a lot about Gen Z. They know that they have been looked down on. They know that many adults think they are frivolous. They also know that they have a lot of hard work in front of them because of the state of the world. And we're going to get a little more deeply into that as we go here. I'm now going to talk about some of the aspects of Gen Z that I think may be of interest to you. The first thing I wanted to talk about here is identity and community, because that is one of the confusing parts to many adults of these young adults. They can't understand the gender issues, the pronoun issues. It's like, why are they doing this? And I want, again, this speed, scale, and scope point, I want you to think about a 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old on the internet. This is a time when people are trying to figure out who they are. And it used to be that we were fairly constrained by the models that we had, who we could look at. We had our family, we had our neighborhood, we had our places of worship, we had even our nation. Well, these kids are quite aware that they are in a world of 7 billion people, because that's what they get to see and have long seen on the internet. So they're trying to do the identity work to figure out who they are with so many more models to choose from. So I think it's very interesting to think about this access to information in terms of building identity. And so for them, they are constantly trying things on. Does this feel right? Does this feel like it's me? What that has done is not only give them a sense of trying to find their own identity, but it has also given them tolerance for others. So just as they feel they can try different identities on, they are looking at people around them who are different from them and saying, okay, you're trying to figure out who you are. So they have a lot of respect for difference and tolerance. So this quote, this top quote here, is from a sociologist who has also studied some of these young people, and he says, it's about a new culture of collective appreciation for the differences among us. It's about opening up to creativity and authenticity in how we think, feel, and act in the world. It's about being able to look in the mirror and see reflected back what feels right in our own minds. So they are, this is in the interviews over and over and over again, young people said this was the area where they wished their parents better understood and could better respect the different ways that people can be in the world. Then that is related to community, because as we all know, especially during the pandemic, you can find a community for anything. Well, these kids, again, from the earliest time, have been able to find communities, and it's plural, communities on the internet. These are very real. They use the communities to help figure out their identity as they're growing up. They go to a community. Does it feel right? Doesn't it feel right? If it does feel right, they start to identify. They become part of that community. If it doesn't feel right, they leave. And all of us, I think, increasingly have experienced community on the internet. Well, again, if you put yourself in the mind of a 10-year-old or 11-year-old or a 12-year-old with all these choices of communities, you have a better sense of what they experienced growing up. And it too has led them to have a sense of reliance on peers, because it's mostly peers that they are talking to in these communities, and a sense of possibility. There are many possibilities. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This notion of self-reliance is extremely, extremely important. This first quote here that I have on this slide is very representative of what we would hear over and over again. This was from a boy in Britain. When my grandma was 10 years old, you weren't allowed to question the authority or you get a slap. You go to church, you pray, you do what your parents say. Whereas nowadays, if you're 10, the internet can maybe make you question things. You don't need your mom there. You can look at information. Over and over and over again, we heard that these kids had to forge their own way. And it goes back to this notion of the kids were often ahead of the parents in dealing with technology and coping with technology and understanding technology. But if you think about how much the world has changed since 1995, in almost every respect, these kids were at the forefront of that. Their parents were struggling to catch up often. And some parents couldn't necessarily provide the guidance about the future, even about the present, that we long expected parents to be able to do. So if you think about the fact that these kids could go to the internet for whatever, to find what they were looking for. And at the same time, in many schools, the way people were being taught was different. It was much more about groups of kids working together to find answers. It wasn't a didactic, the teacher will tell you the answer. So there's been a whole change in how we learn. So you will find, for the most part, Gen Z has much less respect for expertise. They figure they can find it. If they need something, they will go to an expert and listen, but they're not going to take at face value just because someone says, I know better. And this really is a factor in the workplace. And then they also grew up in just deluged with advertising, false advertising. So they're very, they look for authenticity. That doesn't mean that they're not, that they don't actually respect when someone is made up or whatever you'll see with influencers. But they want the influencer to be honest. If you're putting on a persona and you're honest about it, that's okay. But don't say, for example, if you are a beauty influencer, that you've never had plastic surgery and then it's discovered that you have plastic surgery. That is absolutely wrong in the eyes of Gen Z. So they're a bit cynical. They are, as one of my former mentors described, things they trust but verify. The other thing about this is that then when it comes to leadership and their expectations about leadership, this second quote on the slide is relevant. They very much, and we saw this over and over again in the interviews and in the surveys, they are not fans of hierarchical leadership. They want servant leadership. They want a leader who can understand truly what is for the good of the group. And so this one quote is kind of an example. Leadership is not just one person. Leadership only comes if you talk to other people and you decide that whatever feels right is among the majority. This last point on the slide is also very significant. They strongly prefer to collaborate. They often, when they were going to school, collaborated on projects, got group grades. They grew up in an era of Wikipedia, GoFundMe, lots of collaborative effort, and they're comfortable in collaboration. One of the things that got me interested in the generation to begin with was I had an advisee at Stanford who, when it came time to choose her major, said she only wanted to choose a major where she could work with others, that work for her was so much more enjoyable. So that's why she actually went into computer science instead of where she had been leaning before, which was in one of the liberal arts. She wanted to collaborate. Very, very common in this work group, in this age group, sorry. So they are very bonded as a generation. And these experiences that they've had that are somewhat unique to them, where they had to kind of be ahead of their parents often, cause them to really turn to each other. And I put this one quote in here because I think it is telling. It explains a little bit about why they turn to each other. The quote is, "I don't understand why adults are so worried about social media. I'm much more likely to get killed at school than I am on Instagram." So while their parents were worrying about things that they saw online, these kids together were going through some very scary experiences at school. And it's interesting, the parents of this age group were often so worried about letting their kids ride the bicycle 4 blocks away, but were not aware of what these kids were seeing online. And so these kids, they have high empathy for the most part, but many of them have been burned out at an early age because of what they've seen online. They've seen gun violence, they've seen technology run rampant. They've seen climate change be a big worry. They've seen instability of existing institutions, whether it's work or religion or politics or education. They think of life as precarious, more precarious. And so they really, really, really bond with their peers. And one of the things that we found so interesting in the interviews and the surveys is their very deep, very trusted connections with their friends. And one of the things that surprised us is when we asked them how they preferred to communicate, almost to a person, they said they preferred to communicate in person because they really wanted to watch how a person responded. But this connection with peers is so deep. We had one young woman who said when she wakes up from a nightmare at night, she texts her best friend, even though she knew that the best friend wouldn't see the text till the morning. The fact that she could tell the best friend what was scary in the dream was enough to calm her down. These are very tight bonds in this age group. At the same time, they are, I'm sure many of you have heard of the OK Boomer thing. What OK Boomer was a Gen Z response when an older person would say, "You really don't understand," or "Let me tell you what you're doing." And for Gen Z, instead of trying to argue, they were just like, okay, if that's what you think, fine. They are very, very worried about their future, both personally. A lot of them talked about the worries about making enough money to have children, to have a family, to have a home. And they are extremely worried about the state of the climate, about political unrest, about all the things that we all read about regularly. Pandemics were mentioned by them even before COVID. So they live in a very a world of constant change. They find their stability, but they find it periodically. I kind of analogize it to living inside a kaleidoscope. You know, the kaleidoscope turns, everything changes, it stops. You kind of get your footing, then the kaleidoscope turns again. That's the world they have grown up in and the world they expect. So they don't fully understand why we elders, their elders, haven't worked harder to address these problems. And the thing that we have seen is that they they're not slackers. They are willing to work on these problems. They know these problems are enormous. They trust each other, but they know they have a hard road ahead of them. The one thing I also didn't mention here, but I want to, is there's a lot of conversation about mental health and whether technology has affected their mental health. There was a huge study done of this age group and their use of technology, social media, all kinds of technology. And it was a huge study, and the study found that these kids were not, the use of technology was not creating problems. The fact is, and I'm not saying that they, like many people, don't have mental health issues. We're talking a lot about it in the pandemic, but they are a generation that grew up being told to listen to their feelings, and they do. So when they also grew up as culturally, we became much more open in talking about mental health issues. So they share with their friends. They are much more open when they're not feeling good. And they help each other. And I often remind people that if you think about the opioid epidemic, that is not Gen Z, that's older people. So I just want to mention this because I think Gen Z gets a bad rap on these issues. They actually have done an excellent job of taming technology, of learning to use it for their ends. And it's one of the reasons that I think we actually need to listen to them more, because they are ahead of us meaning older people, in understanding how we are going to live in a digital age. And with that in mind, I want to give you the last slide. Some of you may know Julie Lythcott-Hames. She wrote the book that was very popular about helicopter parenting, basically saying to parents, don't do this to your kids. And she was very critical about Gen Z in the early days. And Julie, who's a friend, had a I don't know if it's a 180 turnaround, but she definitely had a turnaround in her views. And here is the quote: "Maybe being born on a planet facing potentially cataclysmic climate change instills a voice that will not be silenced. Maybe being thrust ill-equipped into the real world with all its challenges forces a human to sink or swim. Maybe Charles Darwin is smiling. Maybe precisely because of their environment, they're not wimps, but warriors who will be capable of saving themselves. Maybe then we should be interested in how they've adapted to this changed world and in how to join them." And I will say that the four of us who collaborated on this study, and again, anthropologist, sociologist, linguist, historian, all older, who started out dubious, have all ended up having learned a lot from this generation. So we've written a book. It'll come out next year. And our hope is that the book will help everyone be able to do this cross-generational communication in a better way. So I'll leave it at that. I will look forward to your questions, and I thank you very much.